I always like to kind of rely on the CIS controls, which are really standards and controls that we can implement in order to reduce risk, but also remain compliant. At the end of the day, compliance is not security, but good security should enable compliance. Sometimes we blend those two together and we often confuse ourselves in terms of which things we should do first. And so compliance is necessary, but build a scalable security program, we need to start with the controls and the standards that are most important.
Welcome to the CMMC Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Phillips, a certified CMMC assessor and CMMC provisional instructor. Before we get started, if you're liking the podcast, certainly subscribe. It really helps us out a lot. I'm thrilled today because I have Emilyann Fogarty. She's the Chief Information Security Officer at NYSERNet. So she's going to be sharing some insights that she's gaining while serving on the front lines of servicing higher ed. How are you, Emilyann?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. That you can make some time. I'm sure you're being kept very busy in your current role. So speaking of that, tell us more about your current role.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me. And yes, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at NYSERNet. NYSERNet is a nonprofit organization that has been around for nearly 40 years, and we primarily serve education as it pertains to higher ed and lower ed and other nonprofit entities throughout the Northeast. Historically, we have really been a research and education network and providing connectivity to those institutions for high-speed internet access for their research and connectivity needs. But I was actually brought on to NYSERNet earlier this year because we're also really aware of some of the new challenges and pain points that education institutions have related to meeting cybersecurity demands, compliance, and certainly strategy around cybersecurity. Before joining NYSERNet, I actually have spent a number of years in different cybersecurity roles, building programs, both on the product security side of things, as well as traditional cybersecurity and information security programs. Before that, I also had a background in product development. So what I bring to NYSERNet is a bit of a dual hat in terms of traditional CISO roles, as well as thinking about security strategies for our membership community at large.
Yeah, you definitely have a diverse background.
Yeah, a lot of us have really different backgrounds, which kind of makes us all interesting folks to interview because sometimes we don't come from the technical backgrounds. And I'm a good example of that.
Yeah, and I love that because it shows that there's more than one pathway to that Chief Information Security Officer role. It does help having those varied perspectives.
Yeah.
Before we dive into the detail, all of the new challenges that higher ed is facing, there's no shortage of them. So it sure keeps you really busy. But what do you do for fun outside of work?
That's a great question. Well, I have a 5 and a 7-year-old. My fun is usually wrapped around their fun. Being super busy, but I actually have a creative side of my brain. So I really enjoy home decorating, cooking, anything that involves kind of getting my hands dirty. When I'm not catering to my children and their activities, I like to take my hand at doing some crafting and some baking and cooking.
Cool. My wife is into the crafts. She recently went to a sewing class.
Yeah.
She's excited about that.
Kind of got me excited that I could be a little bit of a DIYer as I'm following some of these other amazing women on Instagram. Like I could do that. So I'll a little bit, but as to our kids' busier schedules, I find it less time to devote to those types of things.
Definitely. And with that, creativity helps within the cybersecurity realm as well.
It totally does. Yeah.
With creative solutions for security.
Unlimited budgets. Right? You have to work within your means and use it sometimes. So definitely to play there as well.
Certainly every organization has a limited budget. There's no blank checks.
Exactly.
I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, CMMC Proof Compliance Acceleration System.
Are you feeling overwhelmed by the complex world of CMMC compliance? You're not alone. Small to mid-sized defense contractors are often swamped by the massive list of requirements, unsure of where to begin, lacking resources, and fearing assessment failure. But there's a solution. CMMC Proof, your compliance acceleration system. Unlike typical GRC tools, CMMC Proof breaks down the process into 5 easy-to-follow phases, guiding you through each step of your compliance journey. With everything you need in one place, from CMMC Level 1 and 2 requirements to evidence tracking and more, you'll never feel lost again. Get CMMC compliant faster and easier than ever before. Our system ensures nothing is missed, saving you time and effort. Built by CMMC certified assessors with decades of experience, CMMC Proof delivers real-world expertise and guidance you can trust. By the time your assessment comes, you won't just be ready, you'll be confident. Visit CMMCproof.com to start your 7-day free trial and accelerate your CMMC compliance today.
You mentioned at NYSERNet, one of the reasons you're brought on just kind of help with the new challenges that higher ed institutions and also nonprofits are facing. Can you talk to some of those unique challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not unheard of that the education sector has seen a significant increase in targeted attacks over the last year or two. We see daily reports of increased ransomware attacks, doubling numbers compared to prior year. The threats are really increasing in education in particular. And what we see is, just like every other industry, we still continue to have increasing demands from regulation, from compliance requirements, and still the same challenges we just talked about related to limited budget, limited resources. So higher demands, higher pressure in terms of the threat landscape, but then we still are dealing with the same amount of resources potentially, or the same amount of budget constraints. Really deeply trying to navigate, how do we remain compliant? How do we progress forward and meet the demands of this evolving landscape while navigating the challenges of limited resources and limited budget? So what we end up seeing is that a lot of the community members are struggling to prioritize, understanding what's the first and most important thing we should do first. And that becomes a bit of a challenge for them because they are constantly putting out fires, so to speak, and navigating the day-to-day operations. But then they also need to think about the longevity, right? And the strategy. Where are we going? How does this contribute to the goals and objectives of the institutions that they work for? As education continues to progress and evolve, student success is the number one thing that institutions really care and measure deeply about. So as we think about bringing in new students or allowing students to be successful through their career path in an institution, we're thinking about how does cybersecurity contribute to their success journey and helping them be successful, retaining students, helping them reach graduation and those milestones along the way. Those are the competing business pressures, and understanding how do we align those initiatives to those objectives.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to ask, as far as, have you noticed the overarching kind of theme that, even though we know all universities are different to certain extents, but the student success, I could see how that ties into every higher ed institution.
And, it really kind of boils down to risk management at the end of the day. While we do have to think about XYZ compliance, whether it's FERPA, whether it's CMMC, or any of these other compliance requirements, we want to do what we need to be compliant, but we also have to think about reducing risk at the end of the day and doing the most risk productive thing that we can do. And as we think about tying those risks to those business objectives, the student success, the enablement, the enrollment, all of those pieces, the way we can measure ourselves is tying each of those risk initiatives to those key objectives in order to reach the broader population of stakeholders like our CFO and our CIO, each of those important stakeholders that will help us fund and prioritize remediation of those items.
Okay. So when we think in the context of cybersecurity initiatives, what are some direct contributing factors that impact student success? So what are some of those cybersecurity initiatives that you typically recommend that the community members prioritize?
Yeah. So I always like to kind of rely on the CIS controls, which are really standards and controls that we can implement in order to reduce risk, but also remain compliant. At the end of the day, compliance is not security, but good security should enable compliance. Sometimes we blend those two together and we often confuse ourselves in terms of which things we should do first. And so compliance is necessary, but build a scalable security program, we need to start with the controls and the standards that are most important. So if you look at the CIS critical controls and you start with asset inventory, right? Understanding your assets. If you think about how that translates to our student population, we have BYOD, bring your own device. We have students that are now bringing 4 or 5 devices on our network, right? Really understanding where these devices are, what they're being used for, how to segment our network to be able to give students the freedom to leverage the network, do what they need to do to enjoy their life, but also be successful at school. So know your environment is the big one, right? We have to think about that first. And then we can build those protections around, preventative and proactive resiliency and testing and things of that nature to make sure that our students are accessible accessible. They can show up to class. They are able to access their inventory of email and other deliverables that allow them to be successful. So it really goes back to know your environment, which is one of the first controls for CIS.
Okay, I like that. Starting with the basics.
Start with the basics.
That's so important.
You can't protect what you don't know about, right? I think that's a really important takeaway is you have to know what you have before you can understand how you're going to.
Yeah, that's one thing I see that's often overlooked when consulting with clients. They want the shiny, new, latest and greatest technology and just kind of skipping over so many fundamental steps. Okay, do you have a documented asset inventory?
Right. We all get, lured into that. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the business because you need to sell technology and
right. Yeah, they're good at marketing and advertising.
They are. There's a time and a place for all of that, right? I don't want to imply that we don't need technology. We certainly do. But I think also it's the people, process, and technology that matters, right? So we got to make sure we have the right policies, the right procedures in place, the people to enforce those policies and procedures. And the technology should augment the process, right? It should automate that. It should make it easier to manage the policy, so to speak. And so we definitely want that, but we also want to make sure that we have those sort of soft skills in place first.
Certainly. Yeah. Not going to replace the people, processes, and technology.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm a big proponent of soft skills. So talk more to us about why soft skills are so important, especially in cybersecurity careers.
Yeah, it's so important. And primarily the big thing is that those of us that are cybersecurity professionals can't do it all, right? And I think there's a misconception potentially in some areas that something is owned by security, therefore they are responsible for taking action or doing anything that implies ownership in those regards. But the reality is we really rely and are dependent upon other constituents in our organizations. It's our job to be really good facilitators. We have to be able to communicate what the needs are and how those needs are impactful to a finance person, human resources person, or someone that's in student enrollment or admissions, right? We have to make it relatable to them so that they understand we're here to help you be successful and we want you to continue to do your day job and not have to think about security as an added responsibility. So building in those rapport, building those relationships really helps us enable the business to be successful. But if we kind of come in with the hammer, so to speak, and say, oh, we have to do XYZ control because it's a security requirement, well, then we kind of look like we're not partnering with them. We're not going to get them to respond to us. And when things really do, hit the fan, we want them to be the first ones to pick up the phone and call us, not, pretend that they're not seeing it or bury their head in the sand. Those soft skills of really communication, but also taking really technical terms and boiling them down to business relatable terms that make sense to our audience is something that is so crucial. And without that, we won't be successful and we won't be able to have a broader reach within our organizations. And it takes all of us to be successful in cybersecurity, not just those that are dedicated to the responsibility of it.
Totally agree. I always say cybersecurity is a team sport. It takes a lot of stakeholders, especially in the environment of higher ed. So many different stakeholders.
There truly are.
And it goes back to communication basics. Know your audience. Who are you talking to? Making sure you're speaking their language. How do I translate this technical jargon into business terms?
At the end of the day, we're all human, right? We all make mistakes and we all have human lives outside of work. And so I think even taking it so far as to making it personal to them and their personal life, like if they're willing to understand the impact of their medical records getting impacted, from a weak password, for example, then they're more likely to apply those good hygiene skills at home, which will then help them, in the long run. And they'll also carry those behaviors into their work environment. So we really want to think about the whole person, not just the person that's showing up to work.
Yeah, I like that personable approach. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That soft touch, which just traditionally has been commonly missing in cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's hard, especially as we think about newer generations of professionals coming into these roles. And as they're going into their schooling and they're getting trained, they're thinking about all of the practical skills that they're going to need in the workforce. But the business skills and the acumen, those types of things, they do take longer, but they're so important. If you can get those skills crisp and developed and robust, the more successful you'll be in a shorter amount of time. And that's the sort of the crux of the issue, I think, is really leaning into those other skills outside of the technical that are really going to bring you the longevity you need to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly I've seen where the most successful CISOs have had all those various skills. They're not just technical. It's been a lot of of their time interfacing with those stakeholders outside of IT,
Yeah.
building that rapport and a translator.
Yeah. And it goes back to other types of priorities, right? Cybersecurity is one priority, but an institution or an organization, they have different priorities as well. And they have different goals and objectives. So, it's helping them understand how these things all fit together. It's being a partner versus being someone that's just asking for more money year after year. It helps us understand, what drives the organization and what those motivating factors are. And if we can tie our initiatives to those things, we'll continue to be successful in that regard. But if we're going off in a different direction and not paying attention to the things that matter at the end of the day, then we'll run into more walls than we're looking to do.
Certainly. And many view compliance as a necessary evil. But to your point, if you're able to directly tie it back to, okay, student success.
Yeah.
Okay, this makes sense why we need to do this because it's going to have a direct impact on student success or whatever other priorities that the organization has.
And, before being in the higher education space, I was many years in the technology sector, and compliance was what drove sales, right? So if you had your SOC 2 Type 2 report, that got you in the door minimally to have conversations, which would then drive sales. And I do think that, higher education will be leaning more in that direction, right? As we think about attractiveness of institutions, right? What are their security posture scorecards, right? What are those factors? It's certainly more complicated because we're talking about a small city essentially versus an organization, right? An institution potentially has a hair salon. They potentially have a restaurant. They potentially have all of these different things like post office and you name it, right? Medical clinic. These are all little hybrid areas within an institution that virtually make up a city. So it's hard to think about compliance in that regard, but I really do envision a world in which that's a factor that students and their families are considering as they're comparing one institution to another that has all of their criteria in line. And they're making sure, is my data secure? Am I going to have the support I need to be successful here? And security is a big portion of that.
Absolutely. Can drive sales, can drive student enrollment. Absolutely. Especially there's been some high profile data breaches within universities, and those
I think
prospective students are looking at that like, okay, because universities collect really sensitive personal information. Yeah, that's something that I'm sure prospective students and their parents will factor in.
They do. And you raise a point, which I think is that the reputation component is so strong in education relative to commerce, for example, right? So if Target has another massive data breach, people are still going to shop at Target, right? I mean, they'll probably be upset, and a few days later, it'll gloss over and more people will go back to Target because they're just comfortable there. And that's a reliable form of commerce for them. On the education side of things, they're really investing not only their money, but their future. And so they're thinking about, wow, like, is there a track record here that I should be concerned about? There's a lot of money and there's a lot at stake that I'm investing. And is that really the right situation I want to put myself in? So I think that reputation component is so much stronger in the education sector compared to any other at this point.
Right. Then also can be thinking, is this signs of underlying problems, bigger underlying problems? Outside of cybersecurity.
Absolutely. And that sort of uncertainty creates a lot of questions and a lot of speculation. And so that will certainly become a big factor in any decision that a student and their family makes.
Definitely. So going back to your diverse experience, like which role would you say prepared you most for your current role as CISO?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think going back in terms of thinking about all the different roles I've had, the one that I held as a product manager, global product manager for a medical device manufacturer was really the biggest preparation. And primarily it was because I had to interface with so many different pieces of the business, right? I had to interface with procurement. I had to interface with software development, hardware development, quality assurance, right? I actually interfaced with end users to understand what their personal experience was and how to develop a product that was in line with their expectations. So I really met all of the different factors, understood their requirements, developed requirements based on those needs, and had to be successful in bringing a product to market. And so that really helped me set up for success in terms of looking at problems differently in our industry as a CISO. So being faced with some of the challenges that we see and how can we come up with creative solutions that are not necessarily out there in the market, right? And this kind of ties back to my role today, which is thinking about solutions and strategies and services that our members would benefit from. When I actually interviewed for this job, the first question I got was, what types of solutions or services will you sell to our members? And I said, I don't know that answer until I talk to them. And so what I meant was I need to hear directly from our members, what are their concerns? What are their issues? And funny enough, the first several meetings we had with members, I would ask about their program and they would lead with technology, right? They would say, oh, we have this EDR, we have this, email security solution, or we have this phishing technology. And so it was always very interesting to think about some of the solutions that they were choosing. But the root of what they were struggling with was, I don't know how to develop a security program. I don't know what it looks like compared to my peers. I don't know the most important thing we should be doing. I don't know how to write a policy. Like, these were all things that we heard, which kind of bubbled back to, okay, like, let's solve for that, right? Let's solve for something that in the marketplace doesn't exist or is not meeting the needs of these stakeholders. And so it puts me in a position to ask more questions and come up with creative solutions that really does enable the security community at large, but then also sets them up for success in the future. So not just putting out the fire that is, the most important thing today, but thinking about where it's going. Like, what's the long-term strategy? Let's build a plan to help you be resilient and to help you have really good cyber hygiene.
Yeah, I love that. Essentially, where you're at today and where you're trying to go.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard. I mean, I'm a planner, if you haven't figured that out already, but it's hard for me to pack my luggage, right, so to speak, if I don't know where we're going. Are we going to Mexico? Are we going to, Alaska? Like, where are we going? You got to be able to plan accordingly. And listen, like, cyber is a little bit akin to a natural disaster in the sense that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what the next big thing is going to be in 2 years, in 5 years. But if we can build those basic foundational skills like asset inventory, right, software bill of materials or software assets, then we will be able to be defensible and to scale when those things come up and be prepared at the end of the day. We're never going to be ahead and beyond, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to be foundationally ready and able to flex where we need to be.
Yeah, as you mentioned, being resilient, where it's not a matter of if, it's when. So it's the better prepared you are as a result of planning, strategic planning, they can be in a much better position. And
going back to your comment too about those soft skills, right? I think in talking about it's not a matter of if, but when, is helping, your stakeholders understand, like, maybe we might not have had a massive incident yet, but that doesn't mean we have everything buttoned up, right? It just means we're lucky. And so really helping our leadership, helping our CFO, our board understand the complexity of that sort of unknown and boiling it down to the foundational elements that help you become resilient, mapping those things to the threats that are impacting your particular vertical, in this case, education being the primary one, and looking at that through the lens of, this is what matters to us and this is how we can prepare, and that when something does happen, we're ready to go, in the sense that we're going to try to minimize the impact as much as possible. We're never going to be perfect, but it's the resiliency and the ability to recover that is the most important thing.
Yeah, totally agree. And can you elaborate more on essentially knowing the right questions to ask? What are some of the right questions that you found that have really helped you uncover the root problem that the community members are encountering or trying to solve?
Yeah, it's very simple, actually. It really just starts with, tell me about your day, right? Tell me about your responsibilities. Tell me about your team. Tell me what they do. And you really start to uncover the governance that may or may not exist in an institution. And so you learn things like, oh, is it a centralized security team? Is it a decentralized security team? Who do they report to? Who are the decision makers? Do they have a formal enterprise risk management program, right? Do they not? If so, how are they managing risk? Have they thought about risk, right? All of these things. So you just start to kind of poke at, generally speaking, like, be curious about their team and what they do. And then you can dive deeper, right? Have you thought about compliance? Have you thought about vendor risk management, which is always a little bit bit of a sticky question, right? These things, right? You start to poke a little bit further and they'll start to uncover and share more information. But there really is no science to it. It's really more art than it is anything else. And it's being human at the end of the day. And these are very similar questions that I always suggest that we ask to those in our business, right? So as a new CISO or new leader coming in on the security team, get to know your business, right? Get to know each of the stakeholders in the institution and ask 3 basic questions. Ask, what is it that you do that supports the mission and objectives of the institution, right? What do you do on a day-to-day basis that supports that? Because you want to know what they're prioritizing and how that impacts the things that they're going to look at when you come to them and say, hey, I have this list of things I need you to do. They're like, well, how does that support what I need, right?
Why? What's the why behind it?
What's the why? They're always going to pick the things that prioritize and support the business. The second thing I ask is, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? Because that's when you start to find all kinds of fun stories about, well, geez, we have this like server that's just been sitting in this closet. They have cell phones that they use to test out different technology that they bought off of eBay. Like, you find all kinds of really funny stories. And that helps you identify your risk profile too. So those are going to be the things that don't show up in a traditional risk assessment potentially. Your users that are in the front lines are your greatest asset because they're deeply in the weeds on some of these things and some of the decisions that have been made. And then the third question I ask is, what can security do to help you be successful? And this is where you give your olive branch, right? Like they're giving you the answers to how you can build that partnership with them. So a good example that I've run into is when I met with finance team, years ago, they said, hey, we have this accounting system and it connects directly into our emails so that employees can upload their receipts when they're traveling much more easily. It's less laborious. They're more successful, but we really haven't had anybody that's going to sign off on that for us. And so I said, okay, well, let me help you with that. So I did the full assessment. I realized this was a low risk and I gave them the green light to integrate their accounting system into the email for receipts. And that was a big deal for them. They're like, wow, thank you so much. That helped us have such a better experience for our users. And now we look better, right?
Right.
Now I've instantly crystallized that partnership with them as security helping and enabling finance. And now when I go to them and say, hey, well, let's talk about vendor risk. Let's talk about how we can make that procurement process more secure and seamless. They're ready to talk, right? They're ready to the table with a partnership. So it's also thinking about those questions through the lens of how can I apply this in my own organization as well?
That's awesome. You boiled down to 3 key questions that you asked, those foundational. Okay, yeah, definitely taking notes. That's great. Have you found that's helped really accelerate trust? Because we know that's such an important part of building those partnerships.
It is.
Kind of leading with value and trying, hey, you're genuinely curious about what they do.
Yes.
So that's key. And then also, how can I make your life easier, your job easier?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we all have to give a little and take a little. We can't always be asking to take more, right? And that will never get us where we need to be at the end of the day. It also helps us understand, are there big initiatives? Are there big projects that are coming up? Because if so, maybe there's an opportunity there to integrate some of your security controls into net new initiatives. It's always really hard to go backwards. We understand there's always going to be technical debt. There's always going to be legacy process and behaviors that we've crystallized over the course of time. It's hard to kind of break through some of those scenarios, but if we can start fresh and kind of put a line in the ground and say, okay, we're going to address that at some point, but let's start new. Let's start on a good foot with this new project or this new initiative. And we can start to break slowly into these areas. A former CISO I used to work with said, we're just going to tighten the screws a little bit at a time. And it's a good analogy because we don't want to approach things as we're boiling the ocean. We're never going to be successful doing that. And also you're going to find new things you have to consider. And it helps people feel successful when they see incremental change versus, oh, we're waiting forever to get all of this resolved. It helps people feel motivated and it helps show progress by having that incremental improvement.
Certainly. Organizations have to pace themselves and going back to priority. And I like that you took the risk management approach. That's why one of the reasons it's so important, because you prioritize risk. And the example you gave, you realize, hey, that's a low risk. That's something that as an organization, we can accept this risk and move on. And it's a win-win.
It's often too that we get caught up in sort of the audit trap, if you will, where we get an audit and we get these findings and then we think, okay, we have to go fix all those things. Well, relative to what though? Like what other things are important and how do those tie to the business initiatives? Like you may have a really significant finding in an audit, but the business has decided we're going to retire that. Like we're going to decommission that system entirely. So are you going to invest potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into into putting controls around that? Or are you going to put that in a POAM, understanding that in 6 months, like that's going to be decommissioned and we're going to focus on more impactful risk that is supporting of the business in the direction that the business is going? That business context is so important when you're thinking about not just the prioritization of risk, but actually the mitigation plans and where we're going from there.
Yeah, certainly. Within a large organization, those partnerships can be so critical because it gives you that visibility.
Yeah.
So you can know what's on the horizon. What new initiatives do you have coming up? What are you trying to do versus being the last to find out after the fact?
Exactly.
I want to be in that position, certainly. So another thing I liked about your experience is I saw that you were an adjunct professor at RIT. What that experience, how does that help now in your role?
Yeah, it's so interesting. As I was growing up, I think I heard a lot from my parents, like, oh, you'd be a really good teacher. And then I also heard, oh, you'd be a really good attorney because you love to argue. I'm always wanting to like seek the truth, but then also, sort of this innate desire to teach and sort of lead the next generation. Formally, I have been an adjunct professor, and that's always been very rewarding to me because there's nothing more exciting than helping a student have it click, so to speak, and having them sort of understand a concept and then become successful in learning that initiative or that topic, whatever it is that you're teaching. But I've sort of carried over into my professional life, this mentorship, right? Part of my lifestyle. And you might call it a hobby, I guess, at this point, but I really do enjoy the reward of helping people that are early on in their career or mid part of their career, thinking about what's preventing me from moving forward or what should I be thinking about in terms of rounding out my skills and abilities and just like being a resource to them to navigate some of the things that I navigated and have overcome throughout my career. But I love the idea of bringing in more people into the cybersecurity industry, whether that's they're just starting out, whether that's, hey, we're looking to switch careers and pivot, but also helping people find their voice. And it's a very noisy industry. It's a lot of burnout. It's a lot of confusion. It's hard to navigate. That is something that I find extraordinarily rewarding and something that at the end of the day, like to me, the most fulfilling thing is people. Going back to the people, process, and technology.
Right.
Help people be successful. The rest is gravy right after that. It starts with all of us. And so that's something that really does translate into sort of like the teaching side of things, but also just the life part of this profession.
Love it. Going back to treat people, we're all humans. So
exactly.
Treat those various stakeholders as humans and try to avoid that traditional adversarial relationship between stakeholders and cybersecurity where we're the enforcement. We don't want to be in that position.
Exactly. Yeah. So we sometimes get in our own ways, right?
What have you found most challenging about your role as CISO, and how have you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, it's different, right? Depending on which organization I'm at. I've been in organizations where we're trying to organize ourselves for growth in terms of thinking about, okay, we're a small, scrappy startup and our goal is to become a publicly traded company. So thinking about what does that look like, right? How do we restructure? How do we reorganize? What are those targets? And thinking about as you grow, the business is growing. And so you're having to deal with more diverse populations, potentially globally, and thinking about all of those different environments, which are so unique. As you think about controls in those situations, you're thinking about, okay, how does this apply to this organization or this part of the business, right? How does it apply to that part of the business? And kind of coming up with those creative strategies is complex because as a cybersecurity professional, you're really the only one in the organization that has to think that way, right? Strategically. If you're in product development, maybe you own a certain set of products. And so like your focus is exclusively on that. If you're on finance, you're thinking exclusively about the finance goals and objectives. You're not thinking about adapting that for different business lines and, different parts of the organization. In a very traditional startup that I've been at, it's understanding that, listen, nobody in the business understands security like you do. And so it's thinking about really understanding the business from a lens of how do I tie this to what's important to them at the end of the day, which is just growth. Startups care about bringing in revenue, no matter which way it looks like, right? They want to grow as quickly and as fast as possible. So how do you balance, again, compliance with the security standards and the posture that you need? And in those scenarios, right, you're selling to clients that are big enterprise. Like even though you're a small, scrappy startup, you still have big clients that have big expectations around your security posture. And so navigating, how do we do this cost effectively? How do we meet those controls, but do it in a way that's scalable and cost effective for the business? And the current side of things where I am now, it's thinking about, okay, we have 40 years of an organization where we've built process and we've built really good culture, but it's like, okay, that next step and how do we start to create different parameters and strategies around where we're going? And all of these are exciting problems to solve for me because I'm a builder. I like to kind of build things from the ground up where nothing exists. But that's sort of like figuring out what your sweet spot is something that is going to be unique for a CISO because they're going to be motivated by different things, right? I'm motivated by big challenges like that. Other people might be motivated by other types of factors. And so for you, it's just looking into yourself and identifying like what helps me get up out of bed in the morning and want to like go to work and want to do these things that seemingly feel like, there's never an end in sight, right? Like there's only more challenges and new threats and things of that nature. And so it's just sort of adapting based on the things that really at your core continue to keep you invested and motivated.
Yeah, it's very insightful. And once you identify, as you mentioned, that sweet spot, those challenges can energize you, excited about those challenges and conquering them.
It's hard to find that. It takes time, right? It's not something that everyone's going to know. Yeah, it's not something that everyone's going to know right away. It might take some trial and error and trying out different roles and exploring different things. But I think if you can expose yourself to different projects or different parts of the business, then you start to kind of collect these data points of, hey, I really like this, or hey, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't enjoy that whatsoever. And that's okay. Like we're not expected to enjoy all of it, but it's making sure that we find ways to fill those gaps with people that do enjoy those things or outsource that to people that can help us in those areas.
Absolutely. So when you think of emerging technology, what technologies really excite you and you think it's going to have a great impact on higher ed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of cliche answer. But as I think about the innovation of AI and I think about in particular how it will impact education, to me, I think this is one of the biggest kind of mind blown, situations where, I think about, again, my 5 and my 7-year-old and the traditional learning models that they are in, right? In terms of learning math, learning writing, learning all of these different traditional skills that you and I learned when we were in school. As they become older and are approaching high school and approaching higher education, like what does that look like? What are students going to be tested with? What are they going to be using to learn? And I really do think that AI is completely innovating the way we've traditionally been taught as students and how we've taught as professors. And I think that the unknowns behind that are so significant that it is exciting in a sense, right? It's exciting to see what the careers are going to look like for these children that are growing up with this leading edge technology. It's akin to the internet, so to speak. When I was growing up, the internet in homes was not really around until most of us were either in grade school or middle school or high school. And so there was that technology that was at our fingertips when we were just learning how to walk, essentially. I think it's going to be really eye-opening. I still remember a math teacher when I was in high school saying, like, you're never going to have that calculator with you when you're, needing to solve these complex math problems. Well, little did they know, like all of these cell phones would have complex calculators. We would have them with us all the time, right? And so it's a very similar example. And it's impactful enough that it affects everybody, no matter what generation, what socioeconomic status, like it's in every part of human race. And so it's exciting to see kind of where that will change and how it'll evolve education.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of hard to trump AI just because it's so exciting and just the possibilities are just mind blowing.
Yeah. I don't call myself an early adopter by any means, but I have been more deliberate about how can I lean on this to be more productive? How can I lean on this to be more efficient with my time? So there is a learning curve in terms of just context switching. Like I need to think about using it more than I have before because I've just always done it this way. There is a curve that we're all following. And I think, time will tell how fast we all adopt it more seamlessly, but it is interesting to see where it will be going.
Yeah. I think back to in the 90s, I was in high school, having to go to the library to use the internet and sign up and get 15-minute increments that make you time to go to one web page. By the time it loads, your time's up.
Exactly.
So what is something that you learned throughout your career that you wish you knew earlier in your career?
Yeah, I think this is one I've reflected on quite a bit recently, which is that early on in my career, I sort of had this expectation that anybody at the executive level like had it all figured out, right? Like, they know all the answers. They've read every book. They've got every amount of training. They've made it because they've got it all figured out. The reality is like, that's just not the case because we're all human, right? Going back to what I was saying earlier, like everyone is human at the end of the day. It's not this sort of like scary elite club that you may or may not ever get into. I think if I could go back to myself, even just 10 years ago, I would not put so many barriers in front of myself. Like I was my own worst enemy in that regard.
Self-imposed barriers.
You'll never be that. You'll never have that role. You'll never have that title that's out of reach for you. And I wish I had a little bit more confidence in myself to say like, no, like that is reachable. And if you are motivated and you are driven and you do see yourself in that role, then anything is possible, right? I think that is something, I think everybody can benefit from, which is a little bit more grace for ourselves,
Right.
and sort of acknowledgement that we sometimes create these barriers for ourselves that don't actually exist.
Yeah. Totally agree. That's universal advice that everyone can benefit from.
Yeah.
I had to realize, because if you take a step back and look, no one's telling you no. It's yourself usually that's saying, no, you can't do this. No one who's done it is telling you that you can't do it because they know you can. They're not superhuman.
Exactly.
And to your point, once you get to, say, the executive level, then you realize that those people definitely don't have all the answers, but they know where to find the answers. They believe in collaboration and partnerships, and they're not trying to figure everything out themselves. They're using their network.
Yeah. Actually, as you get higher up in the leadership chain, less about some of these specifics, right? And this is actually a conversation I have quite a bit with security practitioners or individuals that are looking to climb the corporate ladder in the security profession. Is you're going to know a lot less as you get higher up. Like as you become a manager, you become less removed, or more removed, I should say, from
you're not in the weeds anymore.
Yeah, you have to really depend on your team and you have to enable them to be successful. Your job is actually to clear as many barriers as possible and let them be successful. Let them come to you with the recommendations and the suggestions. So it's a different set of skills that you are learning and gaining and developing as a leader. But there is certainly this like disconnect of what the reality is versus what perception is when you're younger.
Certainly. It's a process. We all have to go through it.
It is definitely an interesting journey for sure.
Great. As we round out this interview, a question I always like to ask is, what's a book, movie, podcast, or mentor that has had a profound impact on you personally and or professionally?
So I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek. I've read most of his books, have listened to nearly all of his podcasts. But his book, Start With Why, I think is really profound in terms of all of the discussion points that we really covered today, which is understand someone's why, understand the why behind the business. And if you start to lose, your purpose and your objectives, then things start to become misaligned, right? And they start to really fall off track. But you have to start with that. And Leaders Eat Last is also a great one for leadership journey and just thinking about the whole person and how you're perceived and how that is relatable to your team. But he's a great inspirational speaker, and I find him just incredibly relatable no matter where you are in your career, and someone that, again, goes back to the human element side of things, which is so foundational for me at the end of the day.
Certainly. Modern day philosophers.
Yes, very much so.
What that highlights also is how with technology, we can have mentors that we don't have to know them personally, but we can gain from all of their experience and knowledge through their podcasts, their books. That's something I certainly.
Yeah. And just understanding too, sometimes we see these big corporate enterprises and we think, wow, they've got it all figured out because they have massive presence and revenue and things of that nature. But when you get to hear kind of the behind the scenes stories of how leadership has affected their success or, altered it in any way, it's impactful. It's telling. We can all gain little takeaways from there, whether it be personally or professionally. That is always inspiring at the end of the day.
Agreed. Emilyann, this has been an awesome interview. You've given a lot of great nuggets, especially your proprietary top three questions that you like to ask. Definitely leverage those.
Yes, please use them now. Go ahead.
Great. I appreciate you making time today. You have any final words or advice you'd like to leave the audience?
I would just say, if you're anybody that's thinking about transitioning to cybersecurity as a career or growing in your career, like take the leap, find someone that you can lean on and chat with. I actually open up these opportunities to many people. Not everyone takes me up on it, but to me, that is so important in terms of finding your voice and the belief system that, anything is possible, because you see other people doing it and you see other people that want to be a champion for you. So if you're questioning it and you're thinking about it, just take the leap and find somebody that will hold your hand along the way, because it's worth it. And if you don't like it, then you can change again. There's no such thing as what I want to be when I grow up. I've decided we can all make changes as many times as we want to in our careers.
Awesome. If you receive value from this episode, I invite you to subscribe and like so that you're the first to know when we release new episodes. Also, check out cmmcproof.com to learn more about the arsenal of resources that we provide to equip you to conquer CMMC. We'll see you next time.